Okay, so for part one, we're going to discuss types of fruit trees. We're going to begin with your fruit tree options and the planting process. Then we'll talk about types of fruit and pollination, as well as growth and development, and then we'll cover planting and training. So here's some common examples of different fruit types in our region. We have Meyer lemons, olives, and various members of the Rosaceae family like apples, peaches, plums. I think it's worth taking a moment to ask the question as well, in addition, what will do well here in future decades? So you might want to think about considering low water, heat tolerant crops for climate adaptation and also to help increase crop diversity in our region too. But generally speaking, when you're thinking about different options for fruit trees, it's a good idea to consider crops and varieties that have low water requirements, resistance to common local diseases or other pests, longevity, they're climate resilient, ideally that require relatively low labor, and of course the ability to meet any other goals that you might have. So we're going to get into different types of fruit now, starting with palms. So palm fruits, their flowers arise conjointly above the ovary, and the fruits are derived from the fusion of the ovaries, sepals, and floral tube. So here, as you can see in these diagrams, apples are a great example of palm fruit. Pears are as well. So apples and pears have perfect flowers, which means they have both female and male parts, but most need pollen from another cultivar to set fruit effectively. Thinking about their flowering and fruiting habits of palm fruits, apple and pear trees have flower clusters on terminal shoots and spurs, typically 2 years old or older. Palm fruit spurs are usually productive for about 5 to 10 years. So pruning out old spur systems that are older than that typically encourages new branch and spur formation and therefore more fruit. We also have drupes, so another type of fruit where they are one-seeded fruit derived from an ovary with a stony endocarp that contains the seed. So as you can see in this diagram, the endocarp is essentially the pit. And so examples of this are peaches, apricots, cherries, olives, etc. So for pollination, prunus have perfect flowers. So, whether or not they need cross-pollination kind of depends. So most plum and cherry cultivars do need cross-pollination, whereas peach, nectarine, and most apricots don't. So here's a nice photo showing the ring showing separation between this year's growth and last year's growth on this shoot. So this is a cherry branch. And on the left, we have lateral flower buds on the new shoot. And on the right, we have two spurs with flower buds on the older part of the shoot. So for stone fruits, it really depends on the fruit when it comes to their flower location and corresponding annual pruning needs to renew fruiting buds. So I made this chart just to outline these differences. So for peaches and nectarines, their flowers are lone, lateral, on 1 year old shoots. And so therefore they benefit a lot from pretty heavy pruning annually to renew that fruiting, those fruiting buds. Apricots are also lone and lateral flowers, and they are located on 1 year old shoots or older spurs sometimes, which are productive for about 3 to 5 years. So because of that, they benefit from more moderate pruning. Plums have multiple flowers in each bud, and they are located on spurs that are 2 years old or older, which sometimes are productive for around 4 to 6 years, and occasionally on 1 year old wood as well. So they benefit from moderate pruning annually. And then we have cherries at the bottom here, where they have multiple flowers in each bud, and those are clustered on spurs that are 2 years old or older, which are productive for a lot longer, more like 5 to 10 years. So because of that, they really only need pretty minimal pruning. So getting into olives now, these have perfect flowers. They usually need cross-pollination from a compatible cultivar within 200 feet or so. So that's a good thing to bear in mind when you're planting. They have lateral flowers in the axils of leaves on last year's shoot growth, as you can see here. But they do also occasionally come from dormant buds too. Moving on to citrus, they are technically considered a Hesperidium, which is a berry-like fruit with a leathery rind. And examples of this, of course, are oranges, lemons, and other types of citrus fruits. So for pollination, citrus trees have perfect flowers. Most citrus trees are self-compatible, but there are a couple exceptions here, like clementine mandarins, pomelos, and some grapefruit hybrids. So kind of depends a little bit. But they exhibit parthenocarpy fairly commonly in citrus. So this just means fruit development without pollination or fertilization, which is pretty interesting. Also interesting about citrus, there's quite a bit of interbreeding that can happen between different species in citrus, which is fairly common. And as you can see, this can lead to things that we know and love, like the Meyer lemon, grapefruit, sweet orange. So there's a lot of interbreeding that can happen, which is pretty interesting. So for citrus, their flower buds form on new vegetative growth from older leafy stems. So this looks like single terminal flowers, multi-flowered floral shoots without leaves, and in some cases, leafy floral shoots with many flowers. So it can look like a lot of different things here structurally. And moving on to figs, we're just going to cover multiple fruits really briefly with the example of figs. So this multiple fruit means a fusion of the ovary and receptacles of many flowers. So here's a common example of that. And figs have pretty interesting pollination that I'm not going to go into in depth here, but essentially they rely on wasps to pollinate the flowers and lay eggs. So figs, typically they have two crops per season. There's a spring crop on one-year-old wood, and then there's a fall crop on current season wood, which is pretty interesting and a little bit different in some ways. And then we have bud development more broadly. So we're going to take a step back now and talk about how buds develop in general across a lot of different types of fruit trees. So when we talk about bud development, we're going to talk about a couple different things. So there's the activity level. You might hear the term latent buds or active buds. So latent means, they're not quite active yet. We're going to think about function. So there are vegetative buds, and then there's also flowering buds. And we're going to talk about position. So buds could be terminal at the end, as you can see in this diagram, or they might be lateral along the shoot. I'm going to briefly talk about something called alternate bearing. So some trees produce a big crop one year and then a small crop the next year. So olives are a great example of this, as you can see in this diagram. So essentially what happens is, you have a lot of fruit production one year and then a lot of vegetative production the next year, and it kind of alternates. So not ideal if you want to get consistent fruit production every year. But it's a natural thing that happens. So to minimize this on our side, we can take some action so we can thin fruit early in the season and then prune before a large crop year. So it's not going to completely change alternate bearing, but it's a way to sort of make it a little bit more consistent from year to year. Okay, now we're going to talk about floral initiation. So for palm and stone fruits, it begins in the summer for next year's crop. So that means that the growing conditions in the summer before really influence next year's fruit. So that's a good thing to bear in mind. And for citrus, it begins during dormancy. So here we're going to talk about the developmental stages of floral and vegetative buds in peach as an example, because I think these photos illustrate this pretty nicely. So the top left-hand corner, we have the onset of floral differentiation, where we have buds and leaf axis, as you can see. And then moving on to panel B, we have differentiated buds before dormancy, so moving along in time. Then during dormancy, buds stay closed without any apparent changes. And then finally, flowers begin to open when they break dormancy. The leaves begin to grow from the vegetative buds, and just activity and growth tends to pick up. So you probably noticed this before on plants, but this is the typical way that floral and vegetative buds develop over time. So thinking about then fruit development, there's several factors, quite a few that affect fruit set, growth, and size. So of course, overall tree health is a huge factor, as well as successful pollination. Sometimes natural abscission occurs, whether it's buds, flowers, or fruits. That's fairly normal to some degree. Weather has a pretty profound influence on these different developmental stages as well. And also tree age, any pests that are present, alternate bearing, like we just talked about, sufficient sunlight, and also proper pruning and thinning. These factors all really affect fruit set, growth, and size, and ultimately how much fruit you get and the quality of it as well. So we're going to move on to rootstocks and scions. So this is relevant for grafting. So grafting just means joining a rootstock and a scion. Typically, nurseries do this for you before you purchase your fruit trees. So the rootstock is the roots and the lower trunk, and then the scion is the rest of the upper trunk, branches, and fruit. So there's two parts to this. And here's another photo of this, an illustration. So we have the scion in green up top, and then we have the rootstock at the bottom. And those are grafted at the bud union. And sometimes the bud union is kind of noticeable on fruit trees and nut trees too, for that matter. So, you know, if you ever see that sort of line or separation, that's the bud union. And here's a little bit more of a close-up about what that can look like. So why do we do this? Mainly it's for genetic consistency. So we want to know what we're getting with fruits. So when you're thinking about, you know, which rootstocks, which scions make sense, you want to consider which ones are most appropriate for a given situation, you know, location, what you're looking for, that kind of thing. And they're often used in apples, pears, and prunus. However, they're really not used quite as much for olives or figs. So the important thing is just to know that there's a lot of options out there if you are going to graft or use rootstocks and scions. So just make sure you learn about your options before you make a choice. So here's a nice diagram that just shows the movement of different macromolecules via the graft union. So this is just saying, you know, there's a lot of back and forth that happens between the scion and the rootstock, whether it's nutrients, proteins, etc. And this also nicely illustrates the scion rootstock relationships effects on things that we care about, like fruit quality, maturity, yield, and all of the other things that happen, like abiotic, biotic stress, tolerance, flowering, tree size, things like that. So for some more examples of how this works, we have a Valencia orange scion here in both photos that are grafted to a dwarfing rootstock on the left and then a non-dwarfing rootstock on the right. So this shows, you know, a pretty profound difference in terms of overall tree size. And these trees were planted at the same site on the same day. So everything else was consistent. The only thing that differed was the rootstock. So if you do choose a dwarfing rootstock, you'll get a smaller tree. And that can save you so much time and effort and money, resources, when it comes to management. So I think it's really worth considering dwarfing rootstocks, depending on what your goals are. And so getting more into tree size, you know, this could be standard, semi-dwarf, or dwarf. And here's what, you know, examples of the effects of different pair rootstocks with the same scion on tree size. So this just really nicely illustrates, you know, there are often more than two options. There's often a lot of different options out there, and it's worth exploring what makes sense for your context and your goals. So moving on to dormancy and winter chill. So dormancy is a state of rest during the winter. So as day length and temperatures decrease, trees produce hormones that prevent growth. So that's essentially what dormancy is. And then it ends when there have been enough cold to break down these growth inhibiting hormones, and then growth starts up again in the spring. So fruit trees need winter chill hours. So what does that really mean? It basically means cumulative cold hours. So the number of hours below 45 degrees Fahrenheit. So different requirements for different cultivars means that you just want to choose thoughtfully about which cultivars make sense for your microclimate and your situation. And the good news is there are so many cultivar options that have been developed by breeders and scientists worldwide that require less chill. So that's just something to bear in mind. Getting more into planning, you want to think about matching the environmental conditions with tree genetics, like rootstocks and scions, with your goals. So you want to try to get these three things to line up. And so that means you want to think about site selection, like climate factors such as rainfall, temperatures, fog, elevation. You want to think about soil drainage, soil type, fertility at the site, any amending you might need to do. And then also I'd highly encourage everyone to think about wildlife. You know, how are you going to exclude gophers and deer as much as you can and other pests when possible? And I always encourage people to just sketch out a little map starting with existing structures, roads, utilities, you know, think about appropriate tree spacing if you're planting more than one tree, and think about how you're going to make sure that it has enough water. This is a great resource. So this is the USDA Soil Web Survey, and it can help you understand your soil. You can also, separately from this, collect soil samples and send them to a analysis lab to assess soil fertility before you select a site. So that can be a really nice tool to know what you would be getting yourself into, and you can look for any deficiencies or anything that you might want to think about. So these are two different tools that can help you learn about your soil ahead of time. So thinking about planting, temperate fruit trees are usually planted as bare root trees. You can plant them in a mound to improve drainage in the early spring and keep the crown high above the soil line. You want to make sure you don't let the soil dry out. You want to keep things irrigated. And citrus, of course, in some cases for very small varieties, you can plant them indoors or outdoors in containers if that's appropriate for the variety, or in the ground. And of course, you can stake the trees if needed to provide some more structural support.